All right, you intrepid Herle Burlyites, welcome back to the pod. We got a great one for you today, and I'm going to get right to it. Niigaan Sinclair is here. Are you an avid Maclean's reader? If so, you'll know that Mr. Sinclair was named to their power list, along with his father, Senator Murray Sinclair, and of course, the curse of politics. He's an Anishinaabe writer, editor, and activist based in Winnipeg, sadly, and is currently a professor and acting head of the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba, where he holds the Faculty of Arts Professorship in Indigenous Knowledge and Aesthetics. He regularly appears on CBC's Power and Politics, writes for international and national print media, and in 2018 won Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his work in the Winnipeg Free Press, which is, by the way, a tremendous newspaper and an independent and worth checking out. So today, we want to talk about the tragic events at the James Smith Cree community in Saskatchewan about a month ago, what leads up to that, what the shape of that community is, and how policies from governments are helping or hindering progress in this area. Niigaan, it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for making the time to be here.
Bonjour, thanks for having me. And I know it was very hard for you to talk about anything in Winnipeg in a positive way. So way to go. Proof that reconciliation can happen.
Listen, you guys, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, what Niigaan is referring to is my hatred of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, which is deep and profound, and through much of my life was irrelevant because they were losers. But now they're winners. They're about to three-peat for the Grey Cup, which nobody's done since Warren Moon and the Edmonton Eskimos back in the early 1980s.
In Regina. It's not just that we're going to three-peat, but we're going to three-peat in Regina.
Yeah, I know.
I will be there. Just look for the guy screaming and crying and doing the loop. I'll be doing the Regina loop. That'll be me.
You can be gainer for a day.
It's important to continue to poke fun at our Saskatchewan relatives, and on the prairies here, it's one of the few kind of privileges I think we have out here in the prairies, because while the rest of the country is focused on lots of other things, but right here in the center, we have a specific life that I think others don't experience. They don't know that we are the ground zero of reconciliation in this country. We are also ground zero for the historical legacies that Canada has perpetrated against the most important population in the country, which is Indigenous peoples. And in order for Canada to in any way move forward, we have to address this issue. And so here in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, these are the three places where we see the most important conversations on reconciliation. They're not happening in Toronto. They're not happening in Vancouver, Montreal, the Maritimes. They're happening right here. And we saw what ground zero looks like about a month ago when it came to what happened at James Smith Cree Nation. And then, of course, we lead in every other barometer that involves the traumas and the legacies coming out of residential schools and the Indian Act and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is the leaders in the area of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. Just yesterday was the National Day to recognize murder missing Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse people. And then, of course, we lead on over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples. We only make up just under 5% of the national population, but 32% of the federal jails if you're male, 40% if you're female. We lead child welfare. About 53.6% of all children in this country, Indigenous children, 53.6% of the child welfare system in this country is Indigenous. Every barometer we lead, and most of that is happening right here on the prairies. At the same time, we have a significantly high population, 20% in Manitoba, about 18% in Saskatchewan. In Northwestern Ontario, it's hard to tell often because they don't keep track of those numbers. We're looking at even higher than that. 22, 23, 24% of the population is Indigenous. And so what that means is that you have to work with, live beside, or be married to an Indigenous person in one of these three places And our conversations with each other have to take place, as opposed to Toronto, where they kind of pretend this whole thing isn't happening. And out in Vancouver, where, yes, they talk about it in pockets, like the Lower East Side or, Colton territory, or, yes, of course they do talk about Indigenous issues, but generally they don't talk about it in the major urban centers. They've got other things that they're focused upon. And so right here on the prairies, it is important to talk about what it is, and we can't avoid it. And we can't avoid the outcomes, for instance, on the streets right here in Winnipeg, the poverty, the intense poverty that is disproportionately and vastly majority Indigenous, my relatives. So what you saw in James Smith Cree Nation was the logical outcome of 150 years of genocide. Those two brothers, and it's likely only one of the brothers perpetrated those harms.
Can I stop you?
Yeah, go ahead.
What's the 150 years?
Well, it's actually probably 250 plus years, because what I always
Are you counting up to today?
Yeah, I'm talking about the Roe Proclamation of 1763 as really being that kind of big domino. There's many things you could talk about before that, the doctrine of discovery and the papal bulls in the 15th century.
But you think it's still going on now?
Oh, yes. The epitome of the country, the foundation of Canada, is based on the previous declarations of the past by the King, by the Pope, which says that Indigenous peoples don't matter. And we still don't have Indigenous peoples matter in this country. And here's evidence of that if you'd like to see a 2022 example. In government, we have no Indigenous peoples that represent Indigenous nations. We have a few Indigenous peoples here and there that represent Canadians, but they don't represent Indigenous peoples. And that includes my father, who is a senator. He doesn't represent Indigenous peoples. He represents Canadians. He's a delegate from Manitoba. We have no Indigenous languages recognized other than a few in the territories, and those are by provincial governments. We have no Indigenous nations that are recognized on par with any other government in this country. We're kind of like lesser than a municipality. Because we are under the guise and the control of the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs for funding, for jurisdiction, for issues of just basic policy of getting our membership approved. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a principle in this country that Indigenous peoples don't matter. And it is embedded within law, embedded within the Constitution. Section 9124 of the Constitution says that the federal government will take control of Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And that means that our lives, from the moment we're born, in fact, even before that, but the moment after we die and afterwards, we are a part of a system of draconian control by the federal government. And that continues into today, that we don't matter. And that principle then embodies itself on the ground in poverty, boil water advisories, murder missing Indigenous women and girls. When Indigenous women go missing, police generally don't look for them or say, oh, they're in a dangerous lifestyle, or oh, they don't, we just don't have the resources to take care of this. We're all talking right now about the devastation in the Maritimes from the hurricanes. And we're all focused on putting energy. The Prime Minister came and visited and said, we dedicate millions of dollars tomorrow to support people who lost their homes. And we should do all of that. Of course we should. We should be supporting our relatives out in the Maritimes during this terrible time. Do we all realize that that is welcome to Indigenous life? Indigenous life is every day a hurricane in your life. Every day having your life blown away by floods, overflooding of territories, by boil water advisories, by this intense, horrible poverty. All you have to do is just type in the word Attawapiskat into your YouTube engine, and you'll see what that looks like. And people have been doing that for decades upon decades upon decades. The entire lifespan of that community, because when we were put onto those reserves 150 years ago, we were put into situations that would be chronic failures, and that therefore we still continue to live in those. This past year, my community, Peguis First Nation, suffered the worst flood in their history, and they flood every year. We still had we had 2,000 people put into hotels this year. We had 250 people from hotels from the flood of 2017 and the flood of 2021. So, what else do I need to tell you? In that Indigenous peoples are constantly in a position of we don't matter in this country. And therefore, when something happens, People ask the question, why? But I ask the question, why did this not happen earlier? Why did a Cree man or two Cree brothers not take out violence on Canada? Because certainly Indigenous peoples have a reason to. I'm not saying I never justify violence, but certainly I could understand a lot of anger. But at the same time, it is amazing that out of every incident, every time Canada and Indigenous peoples come to conflict, whether it's at a pipeline, whether it's at a protest, whether it's at a gathering, it is always Canada that shoots first. It is never Indigenous peoples. But we are seeing, I think, a tipping point as a result of the pandemic. And we're seeing this disproportionate amount of violence and trauma that's occurring in Indigenous communities, has always occurred for decades upon decades. You add the pandemic in, and now that's beginning to spill over into local communities. And you saw that at James Smith Cree Nation.
Okay. Bring this down to ground for me. I know you haven't been there, but you know what it's like, and you've been to other places. What is life like day in, day out on the James Smith Cree Nation?
Well, I've been to hundreds of First Nations across the country, and it is remarkably similar, with the exception of BC. My experience in BC has been very different, and I can explain to you why that is in just a minute. But life on a First Nation is very much one in which it is a life very much of a hand-to-mouth kind of life, meaning that, what is immediate, what is a situation that is happening locally. There's always a situation in which money and resources are always scant. There's not a lot of money to roll around, and I think there's this general stereotype that the chief or some kind of family of the chief are the ones doing well. It's not even that situation. It's oftentimes that it's a poverty mentality, and people are conditioned into a poverty mentality in that if there is a little bit of money around, oftentimes that's distributed to those who you know best, because it is like a situation where people are generally in a difficult spot because oftentimes, because of the Indian Act, the Indian Act has forbid economic development on First Nations. Still today, you can't have a business on a reserve. And so what you have to do is you have to run everything through chief and council. And so chief and council are the ones that often can run businesses or can create a situation of economic possibility, like a gas station, for example, or convenience store, or maybe at some time commercial development. Maybe I was working with an insurance company recently, and they said, well, how come people don't access massage therapy on First Nations? And I said, because there's no place to do it. Like, there's no mini mall that you can go down to. And most First Nations are like that. There are First Nations that do have malls and economic production, like, for instance, Opaskwayak Cree Nation. They have a mall right within the First Nation because of the chief and council was able to use economic development funds to which to do that. Oftentimes it'll happen, a First Nations will get a land settlement, which will be $100 million, $200 million, whatever. And they'll be able to put that into economic production. And the movement these days is a lot into hemp or into cannabis. And so those the life in that First Nation is very much a situation of kind of the money is centrally located in one form, which is often chief and council, maybe a local business owner or something like that who can do some employment. And so what ends up happening is the poverty mentality is so much that people are in a just desperate situation, and so they take care of their family first, or their local friends and family first. That is nothing to blame on anyone, and then to say that people are desperate, right? And so and the key to understanding that is that what that does is that it over cycles and years and decades, that creates very much a kind of tribalistic mentality where families are often pitted up against each other, where ultimately it is created by a situation of control by the government. Because what ends up happening is that because there's only a small amount of money or a pie, those who are struggling for the pieces of that pie then begin to turn on each other. The whole problem is the pie. The problem isn't the people. Is that the pie has been created by the federal government so that people are fighting over those very scant resources. And then it becomes very divisive. It becomes very conflictual. On my First Nation, for example, the leadership and therefore the economic resources have really swayed between two families or two sets of families. And it goes back and forth, and it's very divisive. People are very angry. Around election time is the worst time in our community because we really divide. And so that kind of mentality then creates a situation of animosity in the realm of poverty. That is a perfect fostering for suicide epidemics, addiction, the lack of unity within a community. But every once in a while, you'll see elders step up. You'll see medicine people step up. You'll see youth stand up, who will then create something within that community that will bring it together. Particularly elders, and our ceremonies are the best form of this because our ceremonies were inherently inclusive. Whereas the Indian Act has created this system of exclusivity and division. That's what Canada's federal policies have done, whether it be residential schools taking the children, teaching them that being Christian and their communities suck, and then they come back and they're divided from the local people, or whether it be the Indian Act, which forbids business except for control amongst chief and council, or even today deciding who is an Indian and who isn't an Indian, which is decided by the federal government, not by local communities. And so that those systems that have always been intended to divide us are our ceremonies that bring those things together, reconcile those things. But guess what? You never get funding for. Guess what? You never get support for. Guess what? You've got to fight for in order to just have basic things like access to land, access to water, access to clean water, to have those ceremonies. Everything is built against us. And back in the day, they used to ban our ceremonies, but now our sister ceremonies are banned by things like pipelines, by things like, a Christian traditional faction in a community that's fighting over it. And so you create this acrimony. And that's what I mean when I say that I ask the question, why hasn't this happened before a situation like James Smith Cree Nation? Because in that community itself, it isn't just about this race and spate of stabbings that took place, which is horrendous and horrific, and we should be talking about that as an individualistic event, something an individual chose to do or a set of individuals chose to do. But at the same time, that community also was going through a suicide epidemic. Just a year and a half previous, a young person had killed themselves. Never mind the dozens and dozens and dozens of spates of overdoses that happened in that community as a result of the pandemic, and even the years that was previous to that, which then led to a real spate of division in the community around what is the role of ceremony and what is the role of tradition in that. And like most First Nations, there is a very strong Christian element, which has been taught that our ceremonies are superstitious, devil-worshipping nonsense. And so those who are traditional people, and by the way, our ceremonies have never once ever been those things. Our ceremonies have actually been far more based in love and knowledge and kindness than Christianity has ever been offered in. In fact, our ceremonies are traditionally about generosity, whereas residential schools, every element of the church, every element of those missionaries has never been about generosity. It's been about exploitation and theft. And so I often say that Indigenous spirituality is more Christian than Christians. And so the bottom line of it is that division in that community is also present. And so those things that were keeping the community together in the spate of all of these things are trying to tear them apart, I think it just reached a tipping point in the pandemic. And that's what you saw at James Smith Cree Nation.
Herle Burlyites, what's that famous definition of insanity? The one often attributed to Einstein? Actually, the origin's unclear, but the quote is this: insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We've been talking here for a number of weeks now on behalf of our presenting sponsor TELUS about Canadian spectrum policy. Spectrum, as a refresher, are the radio waves that make our cell phone networks work. Here's a good summary of, our last 10 or 11 or 87 TELUS ads. 14 years of the same spectrum policy, using set-asides. More specifically, using set-asides over and over again in order to spur more competition, has failed. The evidence is clear. We are years behind other G7 nations in auctioning spectrum, and as a result, in our ability to adopt 5G technologies in both urban and rural Canada, and in how we could be fighting climate change using those technologies. However, last week I hinted that TELUS isn't here just to criticize. In fact, they laud the feds for their decision to abandon set-asides for the upcoming 3,800 megahertz auction. And they have some further recommendations for how spectrum policy can move forward to make up the gap. TELUS believes we should be auctioning more spectrum sooner, prioritizing rural investment using tailored deployment conditions, ending the use of set-asides in auctions forever, stopping companies from trading their spectrum for profit, implementing use it or lose it policies for all spectrum licenses, implementing use it or share it if some, but not all, of a carrier's spectrum license is being deployed. That's just the proverbial tip of a very large iceberg of their thoughts on this issue, Herle Burlyites, and we'll have more to say on that next week, including a special announcement from TELUS. Stay tuned. Okay, just a couple of quick questions just to get some fact base. Would that reserve have the basics of life there? Would they have had housing, fresh water, access to food on the reserve?
Yeah, I mean, they have the same kind of access that most First Nations have, which is limited forms of access to fresh food, for example, and then overpriced because oftentimes because there is a limited amount of business, limited supply means high demand, and that usually means high costs. So if you look at the issues in the north around food sovereignty, people are in poverty for the most part, and for the most part, people are struggling to make it everyday life. But of course, there is access to local non-Indigenous communities or Canadian communities nearby in which you can support yourself to the best possible that you could do. But at the same time, you got to have resources to do so. And so it's a difficult situation for everybody involved. And as a result, these two young men, these two young Sanderson men, grew up in poverty. They grew up in the child welfare system. And those, the Miles Sanderson, who is the individuals who is thought of to perpetrate most of these harms. Damien, his brother, is thought to be kind of a follower in this, or perhaps maybe he was a captive. We don't know because unfortunately, both those two young men are passed away. So we don't know the story. But that being said, Miles was using alcohol at the age of 12. And was using cocaine by the age of 14. That's not a normal lifestyle for any young person. That is not a typical way in which a young person is supposed to grow up. But for Indigenous children, sometimes that is the typical way because you are coping with the abuse that you've experienced, the poverty that you're undergoing, the trauma that is an everyday part of your life. And so that's what you're doing when nobody chooses to use cocaine at 14. No one chooses to use alcohol at 12. What they do is they choose to deal with trauma. And that's what self-medication is really all about. That's also, by the way, what people are doing often on the streets when they're living in those urban environments.
Right. But, this is a really dumb question. So just forgive a really dumb question. I've been pretty wasted in my life and never thought of doing anything like that. There's a different thing going on there. What did the substances that the Sandersons were ingesting, what did it unleash?
No, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on kind of these guys' relationship with addictions, and then focusing upon that they'd snapped in some way, or that Miles Sanderson had snapped. Drugs are not what made him snap. And certainly, while that may have certainly attributed, and I think all of the reports that was involved with one of them in terms of his history of incarceration, is that generally when he wasn't using, he was able to control many of his manifestations, but the manifestations were still there. And so you're only one step away from those experiences as being a young Indigenous person being in the child welfare.
So he's a super angry guy who's just controlling it most of the time.
And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So from my own life, my grandfather was the most loving, kindest man I've ever met in my life. But when he was drinking, he would snap. And what he would do is he would go back to the war. He would go back to he was on the ground in France. But then before that, he was sexually and physically abused by a priest. And so he had experienced violence of the worst kind in all ends of the world. And so when he would experience that violence to his own body through alcohol, that would then manifest itself in a rage that he had internalized so deeply and was able to keep in control, but then he then brought out to others. But it is very much violence that it's like reciprocity or yin and yang. It is violence that has been perpetrated on him that then he wants to share because it's so heavy. It's such a heavy burden. It's such a heavy weight to carry. And so alcohol, all it does is it creates a situation where somebody wants to bring that out to others. It is very difficult, I think, for Canadians to understand that this was not an individual act. And this was an act that was 150 years in the making, but particularly within the realm of the Sanderson brothers, decades in the making. And it started with their experience of having been born into a system that told them they didn't matter. And then, therefore, they eventually manifested that rage, that experience into a rage against themselves for years and self-harmed through addictions. But then eventually was very much about trying to break out of that control, break out of the pain, and then share that trauma with others.
Miles Sanderson, a lot of people who looked at this story were perplexed as to why he was out of prison with the record of violence that he had. And I know that it's often Indigenous advocates who fight most strongly against the use of incarceration excessively for some of the stats you cited earlier, and who argue against things like mandatory minimums for various crimes, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was trying to look up I can't remember the name of the healing lodge that he was trying to attend, but I think, what I've also seen in this story is a number of people who are condemning the parole system and condemning the justice system. I'm not here to defend that system. In fact, I have absolutely no qualms whatsoever of everybody throwing Canada's justice system under the bus in this scenario. I mean, the evidence is very clear. Miles Sanderson was a serial abuser. He was a serial violent offender. And he was also someone who is absolutely spiraling out of control. And so I don't have an answer for that. I don't have a ceremony that I can point to and go, well, that would have been the one thing that would have stopped the situation. Here's what I can tell you, though, is that you don't become a serial offender, a violent, chronic person who's addicted to alcohol and drugs. Like, you don't do that overnight. Like, it comes from somewhere. And so the biggest challenge of our time period with Indigenous peoples is mental health, because there is such disproportionate amount of trauma that we have experienced. Canadians have experienced trauma too. I think Canadians' trauma have to do with the fact that they didn't know such trauma was happening to Indigenous peoples. And so they wake up one morning and they go, oh, look at all these unmarked graves on residential school sites. Holy smokes, what do you mean Canada is a perpetrator of genocide? And then Canadians go into this kind of trauma, and it mostly is a lot of white guilt. It's a lot of pandering and ornamentalism, and yes, some real important activities like wearing an orange shirt. And
let's just stop and answer a question for me right now, because this is something I hear over and over and over again. If you are a 50-year-old person in Canada, what have you contributed to this problem, and why should you feel guilty about it?
Well, you have benefited tremendously by the fact that people have been removed for your home to be there, that you've benefited greatly from a system that we have all inherited that has perpetrated incredible harms to create a disproportionate system where you have benefited financially, where, the fact that some people have and some people have not is not a fluke. It was an intentional system, and you just happen to be born into the haves as opposed to the have-nots. You're also benefiting from a justice system, a healthcare system, a child welfare system that continues to try to control Indigenous peoples and put them into situations of dire poverty and devastation so that you yourself don't have to deal with it. And all of those systems, what brings them all together is they are reactive systems. And the point that I was going to get to just a minute ago was that the problem is really that Canadians don't know what to do with their trauma. And I can tell you what to do with your trauma. We have to support the wide-scale revitalization and re-energization of Indigenous communities, the re-employment of our ceremonies and our governments and our sovereignty. And that may say, those are really big fluting words, but let me tell you basically what it means. We have to stop trying to control Indigenous peoples. We have to partner with them in the visions that the treaties employed. And that means that we have to look at a system of partnership, not of control and power. Because when you have a system of control and power, you get what happens on James Smith Cree Nation. Absolutely logical outcome, which is that people are hammered into poverty, addictions, trauma, that they finally bring that out on the others around them. Not just Indigenous peoples, which I think for a long time we've been doing internally, and then now we bring it out into other communities. The way that we do that is if we had a strong healthcare network, mental health care network on Indigenous First Nations, what we realize is ceremonies is the number one way that we can have brought those young men back, and that we would have done that decades ago. We would have taught them the language, we would have connected them with elders, we would have connected them with the community, so they would have a role. They would learn how to make a fire. They would learn how to participate and become an ethical partner, because just that fire ceremony alone that we do with our young men in Cree and Anishinaabe traditions is the intention to create someone who is a worthwhile, what we refer to as Anishinaabe Nini or an Ogichita, which is a protector of the community. And that means that you're given a role to chop wood for your grandmother and learn how to become a good father and how to be a good partner. You're learning all of those things because that is important within our community. It still is, by the way. But like I mentioned before, those are the things that never get funded, never get supported, are often in the realm of being classified as superstitious, devil-worshipping traditions. So the point of it is that Canadians can look to see, feel that trauma. I get it. People go, I want to focus more on Sidney Crosby's Golden Goal than I want to focus on residential schools because this makes me feel great. This doesn't make me feel great. The problem is both is Canada. Both of them. And so if we're going to figure out what to do about it, we have to go, okay, what is the harms that have been perpetrated during residential schools, the Indian Act, and all these other things? And then we go, well, Indigenous communities actually have the solutions for all of that. Indigenous communities would have had the solution for the Sanderson brothers. And they in fact had the solution for decades, which was the attempt by that community to try to re-bring those young men in. But the problem is that the traumas are so deep and so vast, and the pandemic on top of it, it became almost impossible for that community to handle it. And you're seeing it now in downtown Winnipeg. Needle use is exponential. We're on rate this year to have more Indigenous homicides in Winnipeg, more homicides generally, which most of them are Indigenous, by the way, than any time in Winnipeg's history. And that is directly because the communities simply cannot keep up with the traumas when you throw a pandemic right on top of that. We have been able to do that for decades. And frankly, Canada's been very lucky in that Indigenous peoples are so dedicated, so supportive of each other, and so caring. Our ceremonies are so strong that we can keep the most brutal traumas of 150 years and be able to deal with them. But now I think that Canadians have a role to play in providing us with adequate mental health services to deal with the trauma. Then, of course, housing, the system of policing is a big problem. And that's another thing that happened out of James Smith Cree Nation. They had no policing. So they had no ability for police to be able to...
I've just been reading this about how many reserves effectively have no policing. That the RCMP are either hours away or they may or may not come if you call them. How is this acceptable?
Days away. Like, we're not talking hours away. We're talking days away. And paramedic services, never mind paramedic services and police services. There's communities in Northwestern Ontario that if you call for police, they come a day and a half later, oftentimes by flying in. And so what does that tell you about the power of Indigenous communities? That tells you that we have our own ways of justice, and we've done an incredible job for a long period of time because no situation like this has occurred where multiple stabbings and serial murders have taken place. Because in our communities, we have ways to handle our own justice. But at the same time, I think many communities want locally led police forces, or what we would have referred to maybe as not police, but peacekeeping forces, which is our word for we don't really have a word for police. We have a word for peacekeeper, which is ogichita, which means that you have the big heart. Ogiche, large, and ode, heart. Ogichita. And so that means is that within our communities, we had warriors whose only job was to enforce peace. By the way, Canada has used that idea because it is an Indigenous idea. To do that globally with UN peacekeepers. That's an Indigenous idea. That's not a Canadian, European idea. That's an Indigenous idea. Anyways, that being said, and so we have peacekeepers within our communities. We've done that for a century and a half, 2 centuries, since time immemorial. And that tells you a lot about the power within those communities. But at the same time, I think people want to now have more of a formalized police force that's tribally led or Indigenous led. And they want to use this vast resources, the billions of dollars that is put into policing in this country, which is not working. It is only favoring Canadian communities and leaving Indigenous communities out to dry. Maybe we should think about the ways in which we treat everybody with respect. All communities are important, instead of saying, oh, these communities over here don't really need policing. In fact, I think some communities would still continue to say, well, we don't really need your policing. We can set up our own policing, but we do need the resources to be able to provide that or supply that community in our community. No one questions that if it's in Walkerton, Ontario, or Toronto, or Vancouver. But suddenly when we're talking about Puckatawagan First Nation or Peguis First Nation, suddenly we're like, oh, I don't know if we have resources for that. I don't know if we can. Like, do we really need to? But like, it's whenever anything is Indigenous, we always have to debate it. But when it's like questioning whether we should provide millions of dollars of support for the Maritimes during a devastation, I was like, absolutely, like throw my tax dollars there. But and that's the key things to understand is that we have been conditioned, all peoples, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, to think that Indigenous peoples don't matter. The school system is conditioned to us, the society has, the government has. And so that as a result, we're still in this echo of what that looks like.
So, I was just reading CN's new winter plan. There are a couple of images in it that are pretty telling. One of them is a shot of 5 freighters, hopelessly mired in Great Lakes ice. The other picture is of a snowblower cutting a tunnel through what looks like a 2-meter deep bed of freshly fallen snow in Alberta. The 2 snapshots nicely illustrate winter's power. The difference between the Great Lakes and the prairies, of course, is that the St. Lawrence Seaway simply shuts down from January to the end of March. Shipments through the Welland Canal go from millions of tons to 0. But no matter how ferocious winter becomes, freight trains never stop crossing the prairies. Because, winter or not, customer demand for a whole catalog of commodities remains strong. The economy needs its grain, forest products, propane, potash, and other raw materials. And the economy relies on the railroad to move them. So CN, our sponsor, wages an endless effort, not to conquer winter, because winter is, a force of nature, but to cope with it as efficiently as possible. The railway is deploying sophisticated new technology to inspect wheels and tracks, both of which suffer damaging assaults of extreme cold during Canada's winter. In an era of labor shortages, CN increased its workforce by nearly 1,000 employees in the first 6 months of this year, and most of them will be on train crews. It has also expanded its fleet, adding dozens of new locomotives and hundreds of new boxcars. CN also recognizes that dealing with winter requires discipline. Quite simply, trains must leave on time. The railway has been sharpening punctuality in the past year and will continue to improve it, which means better customer service, which is the core mission. Last winter was really nasty. Maybe this winter will be easier. Maybe not. Whatever the case, CN will be ready. Cargo has to move, and that's that. What are we aspiring toward? Like, what would success look like?
Well, I talked about BC earlier. A really interesting thing about BC that you see tons of interesting things and I think tons of problematic things too. But I probably got in a lot of trouble saying things are problematic. I'm sure there's some BC person who's like, this isn't problematic. But I think it's certainly problematic for some of us out in the prairies to do a similar model. What you see in BC is kind of working outside of the traditional parameters of First Nations Canadian relationships or Indigenous Canadian relationships. And it's interesting because the Royal Proclamation of 1763 only claims the land for the British monarch, aka Canada, up to the Rocky Mountains. And so as a result, the treaties have proceeded very differently in British Columbia than they have in east of the Rocky Mountains. Up until Treaty 6, 7, 8, all the way up until 11, that goes into the north, those treaties were seeking to settle Canada's claim under the Royal Proclamation. But the modern treaty process, which are those treaties that are still in a negotiation today for the most part in British Columbia, those are completely separate agreements. Those are different agreements. Oftentimes you'll see First Nations in those scenarios negotiating their exit from the Indian Act, or in the case of the Nisga'a, for example, their ability to perform taxation and to have an independent government. And so as a result, there's a possibility there that looks different. And you're seeing really radical ideas. Like I said, some I think are very positive and some are highly problematic. Like, for instance, some First Nations are really aggressive with selling their lands and resources, or commodifying those things, or creating economic production. Some are very into pipelines. Some are not. Some are really into traditional forms of government, like hereditary chief system, instead of an imposed Indian Act chief and council system. And so you're seeing this really interesting movements in British Columbia that I think give you a little view of what that might look like nationally. Now, luckily, if you want to know what a progressive government or what a progressive system looks like in this country, you don't have to look very far. We have multiple reports and commissions that have been going back to the 90s, even before that, back to the 60s actually, which have said, here's what the methods of equality would look like, or partnership would look like. Here's what Indigenous rights would look like. We can go back to the Calder decision in the 70s. We can go back to the Royal Commission in the 1990s, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. You know, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples has said we should have an Indigenous Parliament. Well, you know what an Indigenous Parliament would do? It would create everything that the Senate doesn't do, which is creates a system of sober second thoughts to the federal government. It actually could propose its own government, or propose its own legislation. It would be Indigenous led. We would get out of this mess of consultation that we are in, which is always a sham. And it's about how much do we pay you, not about do you agree, or what do you think about this project? It would be that Indigenous peoples would come up with that with the federal government. There would be agreement from the get-go, from day one, not day 428, which is what leads to protests and armed conflict, and Canada shooting first at that.
Are people going to really be interested in these processes, Niigaan? I'll tell you, I did a focus group a couple of years ago I had 10 Indigenous Canadians in my focus group. Not one of them recognized the Grand Chief, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, either by name or picture. And none of them was very interested in the idea of the Assembly of First Nations.
Well, it's because the Assembly of First
Nations thought it was
Nations
part of some system that wasn't for them.
It's a lobby group. It's like it has the same power as Amnesty International. It has the same, so no one's probably heard of Amnesty International, who the president is either, because that's pretty much what the power the AFN has. The AFN is a program body, and it's a body that's been set up. I could tell you the long history of that, but we'd be here for another 15 minutes to explain why the AFN is more dependent on the government than it's dependent on Indigenous peoples. And so the AFN isn't a government, it is a lobby group. Now, it may just be that the AFN would be the model, or be a potential model, because there's lots of ways the AFN works well, to maybe replace the Senate. But here's what I can just tell you. You tell me the most corrupt system in the country, where patronage, favoritism, and the misuse of public funds, and you quickly realize it's the Senate. The Senate is this place of absolute nonsense. And, wait a second,
your dad's there now.
No, he's gone now. He's retired.
Oh, he's gone. That's right.
But I can tell you that my dad was on the committees of the Senate, and the things that he has told me about what senators do with public funds, never mind what they do with public computers, never mind what they do with their budgets, their seemingly never-ending budgets there's a reason why the ethics commissioner is investigating more senators than anybody else. It's because this system of the Senate is an absolute atrocious mess. You don't have to be a conservative or a Reform Party person to identify that, although I certainly sympathize with their positions on the fact that the Senate is not elected. Doesn't represent anyone other than the previous political government, who then jams it full of their own supporters who will never vote for anything. They can call them the independent senators as much as you want. And I think lots of senators have done the best they can with that model. My father being one of them. And I think really other amazing people like Kim Pate and other senators that have done some really great work in there, Mary Jane McCallum. But at the same time, we all know that the Senate isn't working. We all know that. But yet I can, with will, we can do anything. We put somebody on the moon. If we said to a country that this is important, this is vital, this is necessary for reconciliation, would an Indigenous parliament be favored? Well, I don't know. I mean, we have a monarchy that's completely useless. So can we do anything? I think we could probably do anything. We could probably, we could spend billions of dollars to do what Australia did and remove ourselves from the constitutional monarchy. But yet, for somehow when it comes to Indigenous peoples, we're always debating it. We're always going like, here's the logical answer right here. Here is a very smart use of public funds, which would bring Indigenous peoples into the fold in this country, which, by the way, would fulfill Canadian law, Bill C-15, which is bringing Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights into the government itself, bringing Canadian laws in concert with that. So it's like a no-brainer to me. But yes, I understand that those in certain segments of the country and in the so-called freedom movement would not be favorable to this. But frankly, I mean, if that's the barometer we're going to use, then we are in a very dark place. I don't think we should define ourselves by ignorance.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But let's just talk about politics for a second.
Sure.
The current federal government, and I worked for Paul Martin, and I'm going to say this, that the current federal government seems more committed to me to addressing this issue than any government I've seen in Canada, both in terms of the amount of airtime they give to it and the amount of money that they give to it. I would suggest to you as a pollster that they do far more of that than is justified by public opinion, if you know what I'm saying.
100%.
Okay. They're spending political capital all the time on this issue. And yet I don't hear any applause. Are they doing the wrong things, or have I read them wrong?
I think your definition of applause probably isn't. The fact is, Indigenous peoples vote a great deal for the Liberal Party, and so I think there is a number of people who support the Liberal Party amongst Indigenous peoples. I can remember when Trudeau was first voted in back in 2015. People were posting memes saying reconciliation is here. Because frankly, the dark days of Stephen Harper, where he just refused to meet with anybody and was introducing nonsensical legislation or really oppressive and violent legislation, which led to Idle No More. I mean, we don't get Idle No More, frankly, without Stephen Harper. And so, this government of Justin Trudeau is the most progressive in history when it comes to Indigenous issues, period. But this is also the federal government, the only federal government in history, and I definitely include Paul Martin on that. John Chrétien particularly, and Stephen Harper unquestionably, but definitely Paul Martin as well. This is the only government in history that has even cared, that has even spent the capital to do it, that has spent the energy to do it. Yes, Paul Martin did the Kelowna Accord. Kudos to that. But did nothing to, of course, he ran out of time. He was removed from office by Stephen Harper. But doing it in the last stages of a losing government wasn't helpful. And then not caring about it till the very late stages. We can't forget that it's Paul Martin who instilled the 2% cap on First Nations, which has led to the situation of poverty on First Nations. So that being said, Trudeau's the only one who's cared, in absolute opposite to his father, who was deeply tied with removing treaties, making sure Indigenous peoples were on the Constitution. The Supreme Court forced him to have Section 35 of the Constitution, which is the duty to consult.
Fundamentally believed in assimilation, right? He believed in individual rights, not collective rights. So
that's right. And so his father, dealing with the oppositional forces of his father is important. But let me tell you, the bar is real low. Just caring is where we're at. meaning that, yes, Justin Trudeau has spent a lot of political capital on some very significant legislation, Bill C-92, the downloading of child welfare, Bill C-91, I guess.
Money, $40 billion. Like, that's a lot of money. I'm not saying it's enough. I'm not saying it's too much. I'm just saying it's a lot of money.
You're talking about the Human Rights Tribunal compensation?
Yeah.
That has just been tossed out. And it's just been in a situation where people are now saying, because it's not going to adequately fulfill the mandate of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Cindy Blackstock's come out against that agreement. My dad negotiated, by the way, that agreement, oversaw the negotiations. It's been a disappointment, I think, for him to see people but at the same time, he recognizes that it's not a perfect agreement. Anyways, the bottom line of it is yes, 100 times. This is the most financially committed government in history, but yet, it took us 150 years to get here. One government, two successive minority governments and a majority government will not do it. They will not be able to rectify the issues of 150 years to get here. It's going to take at least 150 years of progressive governments to get to where we need to go. And what the evidence of that is, British Columbia just employed the first adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and said that British Columbia rules and legislation has to come into concert with Indigenous rights. And yet that is one of the most aggressive governments with Alberta on the issue of pipelines and ignoring basic consultation rules. And so, you don't have Indigenous rights if you just ignore what they have to say and you work with only the Indigenous peoples that you like. And that's what the struggle this government is working with now, in that we have a long history of conflicts and problems, and this government's been very strategic. So what have they focused on? Murder missing Indigenous women and girls, and put money into that inquiry, but then no money into the solutions that inquiry suggests. Issue of boil water advisories is probably their most successful issue. And so they've been able to get movement on that, but still 1/3 of the same boil water advisories they entered government with 3 governments ago are still here. And then we've got
wait a second. Can I, this is an interesting potential, just sort of side detour about a lot of services. And I don't know what the answer to this would be, but I've had sympathetic people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous sympathetic people, tell me that the reason why we still have any boil water advisories is because some of these reserves do not have the capacity to do it, to run a water filtration plant.
Well, yeah, because they've been put into places that are completely off the grid, or in situations where they've been set up to fail. And so yeah, like one of the problems, for instance, in a lot of boil water advisories when they set up a water.
But it's not that the federal government's refusing to cut a check to fix that water in that place. It's that there is no answer to the water in that place, right?
Well, there would be answers if we set up a system in which we had people trained, we had access to like a local road that would access them to a place in which they could get parts if the water treatment plant breaks down, that they would have supports and be on the grid, on Canada's grid, that we would never tolerate more than, let's say, 48 to 72 hours. We would put our energies into fixing that situation instead of going, they're just Indigenous peoples, who cares? They're not going to be on the cover of Globe and Mail anyways. Or if they are, then generally we only got a 24-hour news cycle to worry about. And so if we said to them, we're not going to let these water treatment plants we put millions of dollars in fail, we're going to make sure that they have access to a community, they have access to internet, they have access to all these things, that the infrastructure is one of the biggest crises of our community. And so instead of saying it's just a crisis, and putting our hands up in the air and going, it's too bad that we 150 years ago put them in that area that is way out of the way, and we wanted them out of the way because they just go extinct anyways. We say, okay, we've inherited this. How can we create access for these people? And yes, it's going to cost $10 million, $20 million, $50 million to build that road or that decent airport. But isn't that what treating people like human beings that matter mean?
I'm just saying it must be really hard, because you'd have a difficult time convincing me that Mark Miller doesn't care about this.
Here's another thing is that, yesterday I was watching the news last night because I was preparing for Friday power panel, because I know this is going to come up. And, Mark Miller, I have never seen a guy take more lumps than this and do it with unabashed confidence, or with, this guy went out yesterday in Ottawa. And what you saw yesterday was Michelle Odette, who is a senator. She was a former commissioner of the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. She was out there with many other activists condemning the federal government for the fact that the 231 calls for justice from the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, like none of them have been picked up. For some reason, the country is really interested in the issue of residential schools. So the TRC 94 calls to action, about half of those have been addressed in some way or another. A pope has come to the country and the prime minister asked him to do that. Like there is significant movement on the TRC calls to action, but the calls of for justice for murder missing Indigenous women and girls is just the prime minister came out and said, we recognize a genocide is happening. Anyways, in the weather today, like if you said a genocide was happening for any other place in the world, we would put resources to dealing with that. But instead, the federal government's like, yeah, anyways. So the calls for justice have been completely ignored. And so yesterday, Mark Miller was out there and he went into the circle and he faced all the lumps. We had people who were putting their finger at him and going, why aren't you doing anything? And where are you, I've been on shows with Mark Miller where I have said things and I've never been treated more respectfully and kindly by a person. But it is so disheartening when you have a minister who says, I don't know what to do either, or this whole thing is broken, I'm only one person, or these are typical sort of Mark Miller things, which is, I don't know, what can we do? It's going to take a long time to fix this. So I think that in so many ways, he is the corrective of what Trudeau has done. Trudeau has come out and said, we'll fix this in a generation. We'll adopt the 94 calls to action tomorrow. Like I remember I was there in December 2015, when no prime minister ever showed up to a TRC event before that. And he came to the final event and accepted the final report. And then he went to the microphone and he said, we accept unequivocally all 94 calls to action and will implement them this semester, this term, this month, this tomorrow.
To a lot of derision in white Canada, by the way.
Well, I turned to my sister, and who was standing right beside me, and I was in the front row with my father, and I turned to my sister. I said, the Indian Act's over, it's gone, because you cannot employ the 94 calls to action by the TRC and have the Indian Act. You just can't. How do you, for example, the United Nations Declaration says, which is the linchpin of the 94 calls, it says, we get to choose our own governments as First Nations people. Well, the Indian Act says we have to accept the chief and council system. I turned to my sister and I said, the Indian Act's gone. Well, turns out 7 years later, the Indian Act's still here. And my point is that, Mark Miller is kind of the corrective. And I think that they're very politically strategic in the Liberal Party. I know that you have a long history there, so I'm pretty sure you could probably agree with me. And that they can operate on the two sides of their mouth. You can have one side that says we're going to do everything tomorrow, and another side that says not really. And so I think that that's a significant thing that we probably need to watch as political strategists or people who watch politics and people who are pundits, because we have to identify what is realistic. And I think I'm of more Mark Miller's position, but the problem is that we have Trudeau, who's constantly and continually saying
raising
things
expectations.
We are achieving A, B, C, D, when really what they are achieving, and the Yellowhead Institute has done a really good job in this regard, is very small, incremental, and at times ornamental changes. Like Orange Shirt Day as a national holiday is not going to make reconciliation, but it is a step. It's important. And we need to stop focusing on low-hanging fruit. And maybe we can get Bill C-15 employed. But I think Bill C-15, it's so entrenched in the views of Canadians that Indigenous peoples don't matter. It will be a very long time before we can bring in substantive change. And yes, I applaud the Liberals on. It's not
Sorry, I'm not trying to get you to applaud them. I'm really not. I'm curious about.
It doesn't make you popular to talk about Indigenous peoples. I recognize it. But, it did bring them into office partly because of the situation involving Stephen Harper and the fact that Idle No More was the largest social movement since the Civil Rights Movement in Canadian history. You never saw anyone come on the streets like that. And I think that they picked up on that. And while the energy has gone less because the rubber's hit the road now and true substantive change isn't just putting on an orange shirt, but actually taking action. Uh, I appreciate that you have people who are dedicated and interested in trying to evoke substantive change. People like Mary Simon, pointing Mary Simon, someone who's not going to just sit passively by and let a pope traipse through the country without, wagging a finger at him and saying, you got to wake up here and you got to do something about this. I think that's a good move, and I think it's important. And of course, we can't forget that, my father entered the Senate and did some important work. I'm biased, of course, but I really think anyone look at his record, you'll see that he did some very important substantive things, including get Bill C-15 through, C-92 through, C-91 through, not groundbreaking agreements by any legislation by any means, but important. And that was appointed by a Trudeau government.
I have to ask you, and I could weasel and ask it on behalf of other people, but I'm going to ask it on behalf of myself, because the truth of the matter is, if I'm honest with myself, Niigaan, I have a really hard, difficult time understanding how the reserve system can ever work for First Nations people. And, it's none of my business, and I just support what the consensus is of what to do. But if you were asking me whether Indigenous people can have a happy, prosperous, successful future living on reserves, I would be incredibly skeptical about that.
Well, I, for some days, feel that the provincial system is a big waste of time, but that seems to be around for a while too. And we have a province right now that's seeking to ignore federal law and the Constitution by employing their own Sovereignty Act. So I actually think that the reserve system has been working fairly well. And what I mean by that is it's working fairly well in that it's beginning to see Indigenous governments take control over their own affairs and not need the federal government. And yes, it's been very slow. Child welfare is an example, but you could look at the use of education as an example. Education is one of those, I think, few very minor and certainly limited success stories in that we're seeing more Indigenous peoples in university than ever before. At this time, we see right here in Manitoba, we have around 9,000 to 10,000 Indigenous peoples in post-secondary institutions. That's doctors, lawyers, nurses, carpenters. And that means that you're seeing monumental change in those communities because human resources is a crisis in our communities. And so they're coming home and they're creating that first massage clinic, and they're creating that first accountancy firm, and they're creating that first, there's things that are happening that are remarkable. There's more Indigenous professors than ever before, Indigenous lawyers, Indigenous doctors. Okay. So my point is that the reserve system, we often think we condemn it and we go, well, it isn't working because it's, we still see boil water advisories, situations like James Smith Cree Nation, et cetera, et cetera. But then we don't focus on what is working, which is things like education, limited ways of child welfare, although certainly the provinces are getting completely in the way of that and stealing the money that was intended for First Nations children to be able to, with under First Nations control, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of things that are working. And so let's not throw all things together in a kind of hegemonic way, because there are certain First Nations. And then, as I mentioned before, in BC, when you drive into some First Nations in BC, it's kind of like driving into Brandon, Manitoba. It's like you see all the same infrastructure as everywhere else. You're seeing roads, you're seeing a mall. In BC, in North Vancouver, you don't even know that you're shopping in a shopping mall that is an urban reserve on a First Nation. Like in Saskatoon, that came from an idea in Saskatoon and came from Saskatchewan. For me to say something good about Saskatchewan is always hard for me, but urban reserves is the greatest gift this country's ever gotten. And it comes from First Nations in Saskatchewan. We have one that's burgeoning out here in Winnipeg. So there are lots of things that are occurring that are good, that are useful. But at the same time, I hear what you're saying is it's frustrating. It's slow. And probably the thing that's the most important to understand is that, First Nations reserves wasn't something that our communities chose often. It wasn't something our land that we definitely want to live over there. But what they did do is they often said that those are where our ancestors are buried. We're going to live with them. We're going to care for that land over there. And even if they weren't then, they certainly are now. There are places that our ancestors are buried. These are places that mean a lot to us in our territories. You would never come into someone's home, I don't care what part of the city, what town, what area, and if you said, oh, there's nothing happening here, and what we would say is, this is the place in which our ancestors are buried. They have always been here. This is part of our traditional territory. But then at the same time, so is Winnipeg. Winnipeg is also that place. And we were never meant to be locked away. We were meant to share 100% of the land with everyone. That's what our communities, that's what the treaties were intending to do, is that we were supposed to have as much access to Regina as we would have access to James Smith Cree Nation. I'm actually not sure the land historical use and occupancy in that community. I'm just using that as an example. But that, we did a land use and occupancy. I do a lot of work for First Nation.
You're allowed into North Central Regina, no other part that I'm aware of.
So, well, I mean, like you work a lot with First
I'm
Nation.
not being funny. It's that's what it's like, right?
Oh yeah, I mean for sure. When I work with First Nations, what you realize is that our land claims extend way past provincial borders. In fact, our Peguis First Nation, my community, we have historical use and occupancy of territories into Grand Forks, into North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. And that means that the intention was that we were supposed to continue use of our traditional territory. And just because Canada and the United States came doesn't mean that cancels that out. It was supposed to be about partnership. And so that's when I think what you're thinking about when you say the reserve system's not working. I would say that the draconian use and the imposition of borders on Indigenous peoples isn't working. The situation of little pockets of poverty isn't working, but Indigenous peoples has nothing to do with that.
Why are you here talking to me and not with Miles Sanderson?
This is my first time on your podcast. I spend the rest of my life talking to the Miles Sandersons of the world. In fact,
sorry, that's not what I meant. That's not what sorry, I really didn't. Sorry, didn't mean to offend you. I meant, what was different in your life?
I can tell you
what was different in your life that got you out of that and where you are today?
It's an absolute fluke that you have a Murray Sinclair in the world. It's not because of any magic, hard work, American, Canadian, pick your bootstraps up story. It is an absolute fluke that I am here and that I'm not sleeping in a tent city tonight. And here's why. My great-grandmother, when she was going to Fort Alexander Residential School, which is one of the most brutal residential schools in the entire country. Phil Fontaine talks about this. Ted Fontaine talks about this, wrote a book about it. There is more physical sexual abuse at that school than anywhere else. But my great-grandmother, because she cooked, they put her with the nuns. The nuns chose her, and so she got to cook for the nuns. And my dad is going to talk about this in his book that we're working on together. But it is an absolute fluke that my grandmother, because she could cook, she lived with the nuns, she didn't get the sexual, physical abuse that many of those children got at the school. And as a result, her experience of trauma was different. She experienced trauma, don't get me wrong. But my great-grandfather's experience was traumatic as well, but it was such that he experienced, he was Anglican. And so his experience was somewhat different as a result of being a residential school survivor. And that brought that together, then creates a real different experience going through my family, so that when my grandfather is physically sexually abused, by the way, in the same school that my grandmother has attended, so then when she returned back to that community and she was forced to give up her children to go to that same school that she was then living with nuns, but then my grandfather was physically sexually abused for only 2 years, by the way, 2.5, 3 years. And then when she removed him from that school, those 2.5, 3 years would devastate my father's life. But luckily that my father would be taken in by my grandmother when my grandfather took off. He would be taken in by his grandmother, my great-grandmother, the one who was living with nuns. And so as a result, my father was able to get love, attention. He was able to be raised by somebody who didn't have the same amount of trauma that many of us have. And that then creates me, where that I can have a model, a mentor in my life that has a professional that sees that education is not just brutality and violence, that it is something of possibility. And we can't forget that my dad was raised to be a priest. He wasn't raised to be a judge or a lawyer. He was raised to be a priest. And so then he instills in that in me. And luckily, we also find ceremonies through that process. We go back to the lodge, we learn our language and our culture, and that's why I'm here. That is exactly why I had an opportunity that others did not. And you can call it privilege, you can call it entitlement, you can call it a fluke, really is what it really is.
Yeah.
Is that because of my great-grandmother knew how to cook And that's how small it is. That is how fluky it is that you get a person like my father and myself who are able to see, are able to, when I talk with Indigenous peoples, I really don't care if you have a PhD or not, but every Indigenous person has hope. Every Indigenous person has principles and kindness and generosity, because our ceremonies instill in us. And so that's where you get Canada, and that we somehow believe in this naive way, but in this beautiful way at the same time, that we think Canada will act differently. And we keep giving generosity to the settlers and bringing them in and showing them where to eat and showing them where the medicines are, and now calling them family. So they aren't settlers anymore. They're Canadians and partners and friends of ours. And so we have this generosity within us as in our ceremonies. And we still have that generosity. We just happen to notice that the James Smith situation is an anomaly. It's not the norm.
So, can we end on this note? It's been such a fascinating conversation, but can we end on this note? Again, you wrote a column in which you said all of this finds its root in trauma, multi-generational trauma that's passed down. What is the solution to that other than time?
I've said that the biggest thing we can do for Indigenous peoples is mental health. And I think that needs trauma intervention or trauma-informed care. We need to have every single institution, but particularly those institutions that have perpetrated the most trauma on us: child welfare, health, justice, all the first 42 calls to action in the TRC, education. I think teachers have to have trauma-informed care when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And that's what I do in my life. Is I spend, a large significant portion of my life working with teachers and educators, also working with people in the justice system, lawyers, sometimes police, sometimes paramedics, healthcare system. So trauma-informed care. But I also think that the most vital, important element of our generation will be the support of Indigenous peoples, standing beside Indigenous peoples as we revitalize our governments and our communities, as we reinstill our ceremonies in powerful ways that we have not been allowed to do so in the past. Or in many ways, I just say to Canada, get the heck out of the way. Stop trying to control us all the time. And stop trying to intervene yourself in to try to create division in our communities. That is like such I think the magic. If I could take a magic wand, I would just get rid of Canada in all of these ways and let Indigenous peoples decide for ourselves how we will operate, how we will move forward in the future. But at the same time, Canada has a legal obligation to make sure that we are in a position of success and stop undermining our communities through situations of funding, for example. We should be adequately funded, not for the mere sake of it's the right thing to do, it's the legal thing to do. The promise of the treaties was, in order for Canada to use the lands, it was supposed to compensate or to adequately provide resources and supports in key areas. Education, housing, healthcare, and then adequate government or adequate infrastructure services. So basic things like a road. And oh, by the way, that's treating people like human beings. Like it's as simple as that. And that if we treat Indigenous peoples like human beings, but then also recognize the legal obligations the Crown shares with First Nations, aka Canada with Indigenous communities, and I'm not just saying First Nations, Métis, Inuit as well, is that then we would realize that is everybody's success. If 25, the census just came out, 25% of all Indigenous peoples are under the age of 25. Under the age of 30, 25. The Canadian population is aging very rapidly. Who do you think is going to care for them? It will be Indigenous peoples who will be paying the taxes, working in the doctor's office, working in the lawyer's office. And many of those young people are headed towards prison, headed toward the child welfare system, if they're not already in it, heading towards diabetes. Let's to support ourselves so that we have a system that will be the most it can be. We have to invest in Indigenous young people on the prairies yesterday, in Vancouver and Toronto today.
Right. Niigaan, thank you so much for this conversation. Very revealing, very informative, somewhat sobering, but also somewhat optimistic, I found. But thank you for sharing. Appreciate your time.
Well, our time together, we spent almost an hour together here, or just over an hour together, is proof that even a person from Saskatchewan and Manitoba can get along. And if we can get along, then I think that anybody can get along in this country. I didn't even, if I would have had my Banjo Bowl trophy, I would have just put it right here at this point as kind of the mic drop moment to finish off our podcast.
Yes, I really, the Banjo Bowl idea really gets under my skin. And if I ever meet that little field goal kicker that coined it, I'll have some harsh words for him.
Well, I will say that, we played Saskatchewan the other day. I pick on the Banjo Bowl because it's probably something everybody knows. But far more significantly, I work for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. I do the September 30th Truth and Reconciliation game stuff, which has happened.
Super impressive last week. I watched the game, obviously.
One came out in Cree jerseys. The Bombers came out in Ojibwe jerseys. The referee, Brian Chapello, did all the penalties in Ojibwe. We honored Indigenous language advocates. We brought the Bombers out with grand entry. We had Métis jiggers at halftime. Everybody,
you had kids in the stands?
We had 1,000 kids that came from the north. We had 100 or so survivors. We gave the game ball to a survivor who accepted on behalf of all survivors in the territory. I mean, there's nobody that would have been more perfect than Saskatchewan to do that with us. And while, Edmonton's like trying to jump on this, and they did the first game in Cree, broadcast in Cree a few months ago, but it is really Saskatchewan and Manitoba that's the center of this. And I think that, our rivalry is also one in which we are partners. And you saw that really last week.
Yeah, CFL, great national institution. Long may it last. Let's talk again.
Anytime you need, you just have to get on. And I need a little bit of warning next time. I didn't realize you're going to put this on YouTube because I cleaned myself up for you. It means then I can go to work. I don't have to jump in the shower or anything. I just go straight to work. So there you go.
There you go. I saved you some time this morning. You saved me a lot this morning. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Much. Take care.
I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you who listened or watched for today. And I'd like to especially thank Niigaan Sinclair for his time and for his family's lifetime of work for this country. Thanks very much.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly.